Chapter 21. Charlie's Thoughts. But circumstances did not turn us into pirates, nor were we compelled to play hide-and-seek with the smugglers. Unaware of our presence, the three dinghies eventually rowed across the channel and began slowly cruising along the reef. One Japanese waded ashore and searched carefully along the mangrove edge towards the mound, even among the twisted roots at the mouths of several of the larger inlets. Had the opium tin gone sailing up there, they would never have found it. It would have voyaged into the heart of the mangroves and become caught amongst the roots and trunks. But these seamen did not know how the tides rushed along the creeks into the heart of the labyrinth. They would search no farther than the edge. I wondered if Ambergris, the treasure Charlie was always searching for, had ever been washed in a big lump away into the heart of the forest. If so, it would be lying there in the slimy mud, the burrows of sea grubs and crawly things around it. Thousands of pounds worth could lie there, and instead of making a lovely scent for a lady's perfume, it would lie in the mud until at last it rotted away. And so the opium would have perished had it been washed away into those creeks. Not that the beastly stuff was worth anything to us. It was hard indeed. What great numbers of Chinese would give their souls to smoke was worthless to us, and yet we were dying for a smoke. In late afternoon the smugglers disappeared around the island. It would take them far longer to search these shores than Little Coquet. Charlie lived every moment of those days and nights. He was continually doing sentry go, hardly letting me out of his sight. It was easily one of the best weeks we had had on the island. For a week every day we got a glimpse of the black cutter, and her dinghies searched the entire Hawick group, testing every place where erratic currents and tides might have washed the opium onto island or mud bank. Finally, one glorious sunset, she filled her sails and headed south, a little black vessel sailing into red to fade slowly in pink and vanish into the gloaming. "She's gone," sighed Charlie. "Yes, what now? Carry on, of course." Carry on, those words held very different meanings for me and for Charlie. Gazing towards where the lugger had vanished in the crimson west, I wondered if I had not been an utter fool after all. But no, Charlie's reasoning had been quite sound. Those men were aliens and desperate. Charlie and I were two lonely white men. And now life promised to be much more bearable. We were good friends and not nearly so bread-hungry. The potatoes had allayed to a considerable extent the craving for bread. Charlie was again the best of companions. If he only remained so, if we both remained so, life would be bearable until we were picked up. He even invited me to shift my camp back to his. That offer was very tempting, but memory of his chronic turns induced a half-hearted excuse. It would spoil everything if we camped together when he went sick and crazy again. Whereas, if we camped apart, we could avoid one another when he took a turn, but meet and be good friends on the good days. I had quite given up wondering how he managed to survive that awful trouble. He so very definitely looked on it as his own business anyway. Time slipped by pleasantly. Occasionally we went fishing together. We would go along the reef around his side of the island, and his eyes seldom wandered from reef edge whenever we were away from the mangroves. Still looking for Ambergris, yes, and never found any. All I've picked up so far have been hardened lumps of fat thrown overboard from some vessel goodness knows where. Those lumps of fat have drifted here and have pulled my leg a dozen times, but I'll find the real Ambergris yet. It would have to be a big lump to be worth what the opium would be worth to the smugglers. Yes, lumps far larger than that have been found, though. But fancy you finding that opium. If it had only been a case of tinned meats, it would have been a godsend to us. We don't smoke opium. It's like what a nugget of gold would be to a man perishing for a drink in the desert. The irony of it almost makes me cry. Now just imagine how we would have yelled with delight if that big tin had only held tins of tobacco. I'd do almost anything for a smoke now. In these places a man has to take what the sea gives him, replied Charlie soberly, and be thankful we've managed to live here for months after the last of our civilized tucker gave out, lived quite comfortably with little exertion. Many shipwrecked people have perished under far easier conditions. More still have perished in circumstances similar to ours. If only we had a dinghy, we could cruise from island to island and across to the mainland when we wanted to. We could make this our base. Time is our own. We've no responsibilities. We are our own masters. Very few men in all the world can say that. But policy warned me against being drawn into a discussion when our views were so entirely opposite. This life was apparently Charlie's ideal. The wonder was why he had chosen this barren hole instead of some much more favored island. But if he had chosen elsewhere, the island would probably have been occupied either by whites or colored people. The fact was Charlie was a prospector. His life was lived in the wild places in an insatiable quest for gold or minerals. He had believed that this island contained tin. That decided him. The search for it would occupy his time and thought. With the mineral won, he could buy things through passing boats and so develop his island home. Buy tools, put up a comfortable hut, plant other vegetables and fruit trees, and even run fowls and goats on this tiny place. But buy a dinghy and whatever other simple necessities he required, lay in a stock of chemicals to treat his wound, and thereafter be absolutely independent of the world, his own master in every respect for the remainder of his life. For recreation and other food he could fish with spear and line, could wander the great reef in company with the gulls, the sea eagles and the gulls, and he would be foraging in company, their combined interest the sea. He would seek for whatever the waves might cast up, wreckage or embers or other flotsam. His would be much more interesting than an ordinary beachcomber's life. He would have his mine as well as the sea's gifts, his goats and fowls and garden and dinghy to go cruising on exploratory voyages with the island always a base. He could put up a sail and prospect the mainland coastline for mineral. On other trips he could cruise from island to island seeking mineral, meeting other white wanderers and different natives living different scenes from week to week, month to month. When tired of wandering he could return here to his garden and fowls and goats until the urge came to sail again, and this island home was so small and isolated that no one would ever desire to take it from him. Easy to understand now why he had so readily agreed about seizing the black cutter. He had encouraged the possible seizing of it, why he had day by day gazed so longingly at those dinghies. What a happy position he would have been in had we successfully seized the cutter. He could have sailed to Cooktown for his own stores, could have transported his own mineral or pearl shell or other gleanings to civilization, when and how he wished. Easy to understand now why, night after night, he had discussed the seizing of the cutter, should any one of a number of eventualities arise. The careful plans he had evolved, should such and such an event arise. Had we actually seized that cutter, then, after the rightful owners had rowed away in the dinghies, Charlie could have returned, could have sailed the cutter at the big high tides over the reef and into the lagoon, even right on to the mouth of the big creek. She could never have been seen from there. He would have been king not only of his own island, but of his own ship. Obviously Charlie had come here with his own dreams. Why he had brought another man with him to this forlorn place was hard to imagine. He surely must have realized that not another man in 100,000 would wish to live his life here, on a tropic isle rich with coconut palms and bananas and tropical fruits and vegetables, with plenty of running water and other enticements. Yes, perhaps he wanted to find out first just whether he could live all alone with that wound of his, and far from any help. Once certain he could do so, he probably thought he would get rid of his companion by helping him aboard any passing lugger. I wondered whether he would not be afraid of his own thoughts. What effect would this life have on a solitary man after months had gone by. A determined man like Charlie might go to bed at sunset, train himself to fall straight asleep, and wake up at sunrise, but even with his mind diverted by the interest of the day, he must think sometimes. Often I had found it hard enough after the fishing was done just to sit up on the lookout and gaze out to sea, and think and think and think, or not think and think and think. How a man could voluntarily resign himself to that sort of thing for life was a puzzle. That night we yarned by Charlie's fire. He was in high good humor, had been so ever since the opium came ashore. In the circumstances it was quite worthless, yet its coming had made all the difference to two men on an island. We had not been such mates since our first month on the wretched place. "What do you think of at nights?" I ventured. "Anything or just nothing at all?" "Depends on what humor I'm in. That has nothing to do with me. If it had, I'd always be the pleasantest company imaginable to myself. When something steals over me, my thoughts are black as hell. When everything is all right, I'm too cheerful to think much. I whistle. If the humor is intermediate, I think of all sorts of things, how to do things, how to improve the condition of the world, how to cure disease, how to build things, where we come from, where we go, and why. Lots of nights I only think of the island, how to build it up out of a wilderness of mangroves and mud and turn it into a wonderful home. Some nights I think of the mainland and the blacks I know out in the ranges, and where mineral might be out in the gorges and around the musgraves. Sometimes I think of the fish, wonder what fish there are down at the bottom of the corals, what size the gropers are down there, whether there are any real sea serpents, what a man would see if he could only sink to the bottom of the ocean and walk about as naturally as the fish swim. Sometimes I think about the stars. It all depends on the humors. They regulate my thoughts." "You mean that your thoughts are regulated by your state of health?" "Not exactly, though that has a lot to do with it in another way. Bad health, whenever I feel it, clouds all thoughts. What I mean is the humors. I might be as right as pie, but humors might sway me quite against my will. My thoughts are all right. They be good enough friends to me, only I can regulate them at will except on certain days. I tried to steer my thoughts straight as a steersman tries to steer a sailing ship, but the humors bring all sorts of influences to bear, just as the wind bears in varying degrees on a sailing ship. Every man is the same, I reckon, otherwise every man would steer straight to a certain goal, just as a mechanical steamer steers straight to a certain port. Each one of us, when a schoolboy, would decide what his life was to be, and would go straight for it, never varying a hairbreadth. We'd all be mechanical then. But nature has made us like a sailing vessel, and then planked us straight down on a sea of life, with a mind as the rudder, but humors as the wind." Then, to your way of thinking, man cannot rigidly control his life. Of course he can't. Man isn't man. He's a dozen things planted in a flesh framework that he doesn't understand. I'm only responsible in degree for my actions and thoughts. So are you, so is everyone. Do you ever wonder what happens when we die? Sometimes, can't help it, live so long among the blacks. They discuss that subject often, but not like we do. They're sure, they are certain we live again. I think so too, but not because of their reasoning. I feel it. These humors, as I call them, and this me, that is in me, let me feel in vague ways now, and then that the me in this hide of mine is only there for the time being. When I die, this bag of bones drops to dust, and a damned good job too. The sooner the better. But the me that was the life in it will keep on living. Don't ask in what way I know, and don't care. I'm just certain, that's all. I'm certain, too, that these humors, as I call them, won't have such an influence on me after death. I'll be able to control the me much more easily then. Won't have this damned cumbersome body to lug about with all the worries of bad health and 100 other things that keep a man chained like an animal to a cart. We were silent for quite a time. Charlie, even in the good days of the first month, had never spoken like this.